what you want, when you want it, where you want it. This is The Mesh.
This episode of the Caregiver Community is sponsored by Pace at Home. During this uncertain time, Pace at Home is enrolling participants who wish to continue to remain at home. Partnering with families, Pace at Home provides caring medical support for all of our program's participants. Visit us on our website or give us a call at 828-468-3980 to talk with a representative that can discuss with you the Pace at Home all-inclusive medical approach. Pace at Home is the champion for seniors wishing to remain in their community.
Welcome to the Caregiver Community. This is a place where we talk about the joys and the challenges of caring for our aging parents and loved ones, as well as caring for ourselves. I'm Karen Summey, Project Manager for ACAP Community, also known as Adult Children of Aging Parents. In this podcast, we're talking about both the importance and the logistics of how to preserve generational memories and moments for future generations to learn from and love. I'm delighted to be joined by John Camp, an Emmy-winning news reporter and former TV anchor. After 20 years on air, John left the news to start his own company, Ever Living Memories, where he tells purpose-driven stories for nonprofits and families. John taught writing as an adjunct professor at UNC Chapel Hill, offers lectures on communications, and has written a book on media strategy called Communications Breakdown. Welcome, John. Thanks so much for being with us. I hope you're doing well today.
Yeah, doing quite well. Thanks for having me. Excited to be talking today.
Great. Okay, let's set the stage for our conversation today. You've made a distinction among three things: storytelling, story remembering, and story keeping. Why don't we start there? How do you sort out those three terms, and what do they mean to you?
Yeah, those are the big three buckets that you want to talk about when you're talking about trying to preserve our generational memories. Now, we all know what storytelling is, obviously, and that's just the act of narrating some kind of event, right? But story remembering is a little harder. And we can all remember things, but remembering things accurately is not always the easiest thing. It can be a job in itself. Our memories, of course, are notoriously flawed unless something's just burned into our brain through the hippocampus or something to really get it in there right. Our memory is almost certainly going to be colored over time, and it does take work to get it right. So I think we'll talk about that today. But also story keeping, which is probably the hardest part of all of it. So whether you get the memory right or wrong, whether it's accurate or not, doesn't really matter if it's going to be forgotten soon. Holding on to the memories and the stories and then passing them along once you're gone so that they're seen by people for generations, that's the tough stuff. But hopefully we're going to talk about all this today.
Absolutely, we will. Let me back it up just a little bit. You spent 20 years in the news business. How did that inform your understanding of storytelling, and how does that help the work you do today?
Well, thanks for the question. I will say 20 years in the news is a great training ground for the kind of work that I do today. Logistically, the act of getting at old truths or new ones, but putting those into narrative form is a skill that, like any skill, can be built. And so 20 years of doing that helped get me in the mindset for the current task I've got, which is helping people tell their stories. Conceptually, what the news helped me learn a few things. One, that everyone's got a story, no matter who they are, where they come from, right? What makes them tick, what they've lived through in their time, whether it's the Great Depression. Think about this. This is something that has always kind of burrowed into my brain. Pick your era: Great Depression, Great Wars, Beatnik era. My favorite is Old West. What if your great whoever, pick your person, could tell you, not written notes, tell you what that was like. Well, that idea has always fascinated me. And again, the news helped me prepare for a career that would explore this idea. Well, in the news, I did learn that some people are better natural storytellers than others. And so there are sometimes hurdles that can be mounted, hurdles that can be overcome with regard to whether you're a natural storyteller or not. Also learned that not everyone values their stories in the same way. Some people think their stories are very important. Other people think their stories are not at all important. And finding the balance in that can be challenging. Also, over 20 years in news, I was able to watch technology evolve to the point where when I started in the year 1999, I was carrying a 50-pound camera. Now, today in the news, they do still use similar cameras, but you can achieve an extraordinarily close quality through the use of a cell phone. And that change and that evolution has been something I've had a front row seat to. So watching that be taken advantage of by the civilian population, just the general population, and really understanding how we can capture our stories using these. It is just really quite amazing how we can pass on our past at scale these days if we want to. So that's maybe gets toward your answer.
Right. We live in a fascinating time.
Yes.
For people who want to hold on to some of their stories in making their stories last longer than they do, what should they know going in?
Yeah, this is the hard part, right? This is carrying it on past our point of, our time on this earth. The Egyptians had, I think, kind of cool belief, and it was that you only really die when people stop remembering you. Another way to say that would be you're alive until people stop remembering you. And if you think about it in that kind of framework, that there can be something to that. Why do we care about any legacy with anybody ever? Because we care to be remembered for who we were in our time. And again, this Egyptian understanding, this idea that we are alive until we're forgotten. And with that as a conceit, you have to know that books about you won't write themselves. Podcasts about you won't be just done, won't materialize in thin air. Movies won't be made by themselves. Not that anybody's looking for those specifically, but none of these things will happen if you don't make them happen. And the hardest part about the job that I have sometimes is convincing people that their story, their own personal narrative, all their experiences, those are worth investing in. That's a hard job to convince people of that sometimes. Sometimes I wish it wasn't so hard.
Well, I have some personal experience with that for sure. And let's talk a little bit more about that particular point, John. I personally know people who are very camera shy, who don't like to hear themselves on audio and so forth. Many of them don't even like to have their picture taken. So I also know a lot of people who think their lives are the most ordinary lives of anybody in the world. And I think they're often reluctant to try to capture their stories for future generations. So do you really believe everyone has a story worth investing in? And can you give us some examples of why that might be so?
I do. Oh, I do. And I can. I'll quickly mention NPR's StoryCorps effort. The stories that are shared, I love the StoryCorps effort. If our listeners don't know what that is, National Public Radio, StoryCorps, Google it and it's a click away. And it's a wonderful collection of some very mundane stories that are collected and shared, collected from, well, everybody really, but I think the effort originally was the Greatest Generation to collect stories before they were no longer able to be shared, much like what we're talking about today. NPR started this thing called the StoryCorps, and actually National Library of Congress has done something very, very similar. And so we're all sort of talking about the same idea, and that is holding on to these memories while we can. But these memories can be very, very mundane and still resonate with us today, and we can still learn from them today. So I do very much believe that everyone has a memory, has memories, and everyone's lived experience is just inherently worth sharing. I believe that they're just anecdotally interesting, whether we see this for what it is. That's the question. Two people can have the exact same lived experience. They can experience this thing together. One can go on to tell a great story about it and entertain with this thing for years. The other may never talk about it and then barely remember it years later. And then you ask them what happened and it was a completely different thing. And then the storyteller's story, the story will evolve over years, of course, right? And so, but this one lived experience is either nothing or everything for these two people who lived it together. So we all have these times that we have shared with others. And these are, whether they're triumphs, tragedies, we have learned these life lessons along the way. And we come to hold, all of us, we have hold these dear philosophies that we have experienced over our life. The culmination of who we are is kind of held in these philosophies that we build around life. And to think that those are not worthwhile, to think that somebody else may not benefit from your lived experience, is maybe not seeing it as completely as we should. Maybe if people feel that way, sometimes I wonder if that's more a function, not to say that they're wrong in their feeling, but maybe at the end of it, what's at the nut of that feeling may have more to do with how somebody values themselves than the stories that they're sharing. And truth is, we're losing history by the day. And those of us, including myself, of course, who have lived it, can help generations to come by talking about it. It's very simple. And we're not going to know the impact that our stories, that talking about them, will have had years after we die. We can't, obviously, unless we can. Maybe we can. But we're not going to know it like we know it, like we think we do. There's a pretty good chance, though, that somebody's going to find these stories valuable down the way. Again, thinking of the StoryCorps, no matter how simple, no matter how pedestrian they may seem, these are the stories that will, I believe, help future generations balance it all out, kind of understand today this wild, weird time we're living in and what it meant to those of us living in it. This is an extraordinary time anyway. So I would leave it there for now.
These are all valuable points, John. And I know personally, my mom has talked about the fact that she has lived through so many times of invention and change in society and how everything has happened since her birth. And she's in her 90s, so she has seen a lot of things. So we've explored a little bit now about why to preserve generational memories. So let's turn now to the how we can all do that. How does an individual go about prepping to capture their own stories or stories with their loved ones? What do they need to do?
Yeah, that's a great question, because let's say someone does want to hold on to their stories. For most of us anyway, if you've lived a lifetime, there's a lot of material in there. Actually, last year, I may direct listeners, if I could quickly, to a 4-part online lecture I gave for AARP, a national series that covered exactly this in detail. We won't have this much time today, but summing it up, step one is start keeping notes. Write down as you think through your experiences, as you start dwelling on this project. If you're interested in capturing some of these stories, just start writing them down. Keep notes, whether you're writing them in your phone or on a piece of paper, back of a napkin. Just make sure you don't lose the napkin or blow your nose into it. But just write your notes, hold on to those notes. And then step two would be organizing those notes. Once you think you've got a bead, and maybe it's a few pages of typed up notes, whatever it is, when you feel like you're ready, you've got enough material that you can start kind of organizing things, then start organizing those notes. And I like to think of everything in buckets. You can absolutely find these buckets of your life, whether it's going to be geographically, whether it's chronologically or in time buckets. You'll find the buckets. You'll know when you start thinking about your life where those buckets are. And then once you identify a bucket, other ideas are going to come careening into your brain, but keep writing those down now. So now you're organizing and expanding your buckets. And then if you really want to dive in, call some old friends, call your family, call whoever is involved in the bucket, right? Whoever is with you in the bucket. If they're still around and still kicking, call those people up. And you can tell them what you're doing, but you don't even have to. Just start having conversations with those people about the time period. And then they're going to jog some memories, write those on down. Once you've gone through this project and process, and it is both of those things, then it's time to curate. You got to figure out what stays in and what gets left out. And this is, if you're going to be successful in passing along your life story, then you do need to think about what it's going to say about you to those who are watching and listening. It's worth thinking about posterity at this point of the game. So you've got this, now you've got pages on pages or a stack of napkins in front of you, all with different life moments on them. Now it's important to pull out the ones you don't want in there and to put aside the ones you do want in there, and then start figuring out the order in which you're going to put those. So that's basically the overlay of how you go if you want to go about taking seriously the project of capturing story. It doesn't have to be your life story, but stories about your life. That would be a way I would suggest going through it. Now, let's say that somebody has done this work. They've got a list of memories. They've got a list of stories that they want to pass on to generations to come. What to do? How do you do that? Well, there are a few ways to go, obviously. There's the pen and paper route. You could basically transcribe your napkins or put into some form those typed up messages, print those out. That'd be the pen and paper version, just the paper version, the hard copy version. There's also the voice memos. You can do voice memos. You don't need to be on camera to do this. And if you don't write so well or don't type so good anymore, you can get on all of the smartphones, the voice recording app on smartphones, all of them have it as a built-in feature. They're easy. It's easy to find. The AARP series I did directs people to it on both kinds of phones that we would kind of have. And just spend some time talking into your phone. Audio is a remarkably powerful tool down as far as generational understanding and generational memory. I'll tell you a quick story. I don't know if we have time. I think we've got time. If you cut this part out if you need to. Leave it on the cutting room floor. But I'll say my mother passed away when I was very young. My grandmother passed away when she was very old. And so I knew her very well. I didn't really know my mother very much at all. Because I am aging and past 50 now, I don't have many pictures of myself as a kid. And I think I may have 2 pictures of me and my mother together. My grandmother, on the other hand, I took it under my own task to do the very thing we're talking about today and to go live with her for 3 days. You don't need to do it like this, as detailed as I did, but I'm a videographer. It's what I do. I went down and I lived with her for 3 days, effectively, and I taped her. We got her story, and I boiled it all down to a 30-minute video about her life. So now, fast forward, I've got 2 pictures of me and my mother. I've got a 30-minute video of my grandmother. And my kids, who didn't know either of them particularly, if they ever care to know where they come from, my mother will she will not be part of that memory scheme for them. Gone. Never to be heard from again once I am passed on. My grandmother, on the other hand, in this wonderful video of hers, could potentially go on to be seen by my kids. I expect my kids, perhaps their kids. I don't know how long she'll be remembered. And the last thing I'll say is, and I started on all this by thinking about audio, the remarkable thing about my mother's passing is I don't even remember what she sounded like. The amount of thought I've given this, the amount of money I would give to hear what my mother sounded like, again, I can't even tell you. And so for anyone out there who may be a little reluctant to get on camera as they tell their stories, don't think that it is that important. Down the road, somebody may not care, won't care. If it between hearing you, maybe say you love them or talk about what's important in your life, between that and nothing, what do you think they're going to take, right? Video's even better, though. If you can get video, that's even better, in my opinion. But I'm a videographer. I'm bound to say that. Did this answer the question? Now I'm rambling.
Absolutely. And, you have a cautionary tale for all of us that we should be thinking about this now while the time is there. And I'm very grateful that my mom's getting ready to move into a new residence. And thankfully, it's my brother's home. But as we're cleaning out the house and as we're going through this whole process, my father was a pack rat. He kept absolutely everything. And so we're finding receipts, and we're finding his days in the Army, and we're finding all sorts of things about what happened through the years in all of our lives. And we just find that fascinating. So it doesn't have to be something earth-shattering or something that's, a legacy for society or whatever. It's just ours. And those are very powerful memories to us. So for folks who want to do what you're talking about, who want to leave some kind of legacy or story behind that future generations can get to know, if they do all of this, how can people make sure it's seen years from now?
Oh, man, that is the question, Jimmy. Superman quote. I'm sorry for our listeners, but I suspect most of our listeners may actually get the quote. My kids would not get that quote. That's the question, Jimmy. That is the question. How are you going to make sure it's seen by people years from now? Honestly, it is the question. It's the central question, because if you were to ask the question in the 80s, we would have said, let me record you on this beta tape. And if you would ask that question in the late 80s, early 90s, we would have said, let me record you on this VHS tape. But I don't want to be on that VHS tape. That's okay. I'll record you on this tape cassette. If you showed either of those two things to my kids who are in their teens, I'm pretty sure without additional context, they would just look vapidly at them with no concept of what to do with these things. So to your question, how do you make sure it can be seen, really seen and used by people years from now? I'll give you one more, actually. I just recently had some old high 8 tapes that I found in my attic. I went to a company that put those high 8 tapes into video format, what is today thought of as .mp4. If you see a file on your computer with an .mp4 at the end of it, that's going to be a video file almost certainly. And that is the file, that's the kind of file format that we're using today. That's today's beta or VHS tape, or that's the DVD. The DVD of today is the .mp4 file. And so how do we think about that MP4 file getting, what are they going to be using in 50 years or 100 years? Will they be MP4 files? Not a chance. There's no way it's going to be an MP. I don't know. I'm not a betting man, but I can't imagine. What we do know, and this is the genius behind what's the time in which we live. We do know that whatever we do today, we will be putting our story and our narrative, whether it's into an audio format or a video format, we'll be putting this narrative into a sequence of ones and zeros, which is how digital content is processed by the computer. And we know that whether we have an MP4 format or whatever tomorrow's format is, now that story is in ones and zeros, it is going to be very easy to get from one place to another. There will always be a conversion program that somebody years from now will have on their computer, whatever it looks like, that will be able to say, oh, you've got an old MP4 file? Just click here for the free converter belt to whatever, to this new file we're using today. So I think we have tipped the scale in a remarkable way in our ability finally to hang on to our stories at a very cost-effective, very pedestrian level, at a very street view level. We can all hold on to stories now in a way that heretofore might have been left to cryogenics. I just don't know that there would have been another way earlier to hold on to these stories than we have gotten in the last 10 years of human history. I mean, it's really a remarkable thing when you think about it. Ones and zeros have really changed the game. And it's important for people to kind of understand that going forward, because the rest of us grew up in an analog world, right? Our kids growing up in this digital world. These ones and zeros have leveled the playing field in many, many ways, as far as economy and what money can buy you and all of that stuff. You don't need to be rich anymore for this specific project that we're talking about. If you're going to tell your story on audio or video, you can store the entire thing. I don't care who you are. You could be a king and have Ken Burns, your documentary maker, and you could store that entire thing on a hard drive no bigger than your thumb that costs no more than $50. Your entire life will fit on that thing. And that thing can be passed on through a will or directly to your kids or wherever you put the things that you want the people to have when you do, unfortunately, move on to the next generation. That in the other direction, right? When that happens, you're going to move stuff on. That thing, or two of them, if you want to split them and make sure that two people got them, or 10 of them, diaspora sort of stuff, that can happen. Now, if you don't know much about technology, I will say this should not be a showstopper. This is an excellent project that you can do with your kids, your grandkids, the person who is at the senior center down the road, your caregiver, whoever is around. This is not, and I don't mean to say it like you should know how to do it, because we all have different skills, but this is not a heavy lift. Somebody around you will know how to access the video feature on your phone, the audio feature on your phone. Somebody around you will know how to use the basics of the technology that you have right now, probably in your hand or in the room that you're sitting in, that you can do this, and then you can hold on to it. Now, of course, the last thing I'll say is it doesn't have to go on that hard drive. There are the cloud, obviously. There are servers. There are many ways that you can take those ones and zeros and get them to the next generation and the next generation after them. There are a few ways, but it's certainly doable, and it's cost doable. It's not cost prohibitive, if that makes sense.
Yes. And I would say over the years, I've become more tech savvy. I think a lot of people have, and I am always delighted to tell the story about my mom, who can text me and add GIFs and graphics and all sorts of things. And that's just because she's interested in it. She finds that as a great communication tool for herself and for our family. And so that's what she does. But surely if there are younger people in the family or just people around you that are a little bit younger, then they're going to have that stuff because they grew up with it and they know how to operate it. So all of this is very accessible to almost anybody. John, this is great information. What about other ways people can hold on to their memories if they don't have the means or the interest in doing all the things you've talked about? Is there anything else that we haven't talked about?
I think there are a couple things. One I mentioned earlier and would like to not let go of quite yet, this idea of family videos, because these are something that back in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and early 80s, if a family was upper middle class, there's a very strong possibility they had a fairly basic model video camera. That is not something that was only in the hands of rich people in those times. If you're 40, 50, 60 watching this and you don't know if you have family videos like that, there's very, very good chance you might. And maybe somebody, an uncle, grandpa, grandpa wouldn't be around probably, but maybe somebody who is a little older than you are might have those, might know about them. I just learned that my aunt in Seattle has a whole nother trove of these videos. I just converted 8 of these old, the old high 8 ones that spin around, I just converted 8 of those into these. They're all 30-minute to 45-minute reels. And that's all old silent footage. And on learning that I had done that, my aunt said that she had another box of these things. Had that conversation not happened, that I have no idea what would have happened to that box. At this point, my family is a little spread out, and I don't know that that box of videos would have made it around my way or anybody's way if we had not had that conversation. So it probably is worth investing a little effort to see if some of these old family heirlooms, the things that might help tell the story of what our families looked like, sounded like. There are these old videos with audio on them. I actually found 3 of those as well. You want to know some heartbreak? I talked about my mother and wanting to hear her. One of these family videos, I had some dates really faintly scrabbled in and on the label. And there were dates that were compatible because my mother died when I was very young. I mentioned there were dates that were compatible with when she would have been around and when I would have been around. Oh, so I got this thing. I transcribed it. I listened. The audio is there. She is on one clip like this. You can see her on a couch kind of in the background, but they're singing happy birthday, I think, to my cousin. And that's the only part of the clip. They're all singing. So you can't tell what she sounds like because there's all, and the videographer, who's my granddad, he's singing. So there's just no chance of hearing her anyway. But I will say this particular story is heartbreaking because I'd love to know what she sounded like. But those opportunities and the rest of the videos, it's priceless. It's just, I cannot recommend enough just asking around to see if you have these videos. If you do, investing the time and resources if you have them. And I think it's not terribly costly. It might be, maybe, I don't know, $50 per reel. I don't know if it sounds about right, about what I might have paid, but it's worth doing for you. And even if you don't really care, somebody will care. Every family's got those historians in them. Every family has mine's my Uncle David. Every family has the person who really cares about where you come from, where the family started, what the picture of the old house looked like. Every family's got that person or those people. If you're not the person in the family, that doesn't mean that your contribution to the family is less important, and that in 50 years or 100 years, there won't still be somebody in the family who does care, and then that person might really care about your part in the family. And so it's not, it all sort of works in my head anyway, the way this works when you step back and look at it kind of in a geologic time frame. You look at it from a generational time frame. We just don't know how our families are going to weave together in 100 years. But somebody very likely down there, I know my Uncle David would be interested in just about anything anybody had to say a long time back. And that matters. That really does matter. I'll mention just a couple more things. One, you asked about how people who don't want the project of it, but still think it's important to capture these stories or at least to have some of these lived experiences passed on, and people who think that's important but don't need the project. Well, then start telling your stories. That people want to hear them. Even if you think they don't, I'm pretty sure people do. I'll tell you one more quick story. I went up recently to my fiance's family home, and in the Pittsburgh area, and spend a couple days with her parents, gathering their stories, just to do this very thing that we're talking about with her family. And during my conversations with her father, who was in the war. He was in he was in Vietnam, excuse me, her father. And during my conversations with him, I learned things about his service and his valor that I don't think his wife knew. And my fiance didn't know, I don't think. And I just learned things about him that just because he was ready to tell the stories. Time has a way of giving people space and the freedom to tell their story. He wasn't comfortable. He's a veteran, and like many veterans, was not comfortable telling his story for many, many years. Now he is, but no one had thought to ask him really in many, many years. And so there was this gap. He can now tell the story, but he thinks no one cares about the story. But everyone cared about the story. He was shocked to learn, but everyone was like, I didn't know that. And I was like, yeah, I did that. And so I think these are the experiences that once you start telling your stories and start talking, you may be surprised at what people think. You may be surprised to learn that others have questions further that might dig a little deeper into your story than you'd think they would even really care about. But I feel strongly that we have a shared experience. This humanity thing is a shared experience. And the more that we can tap into each other's little view, the better off we're going to be and the better off we're all going to be. There's a great quote from Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. He says, I shouldn't say he says, of course, he's just a fictional character, but he says, as he's talking to his daughter Scout, he says, you never really know a person until you crawl into his skin and walk around a while, or something very close to that. And that's very true. And one way that we can help people get to know us and help people get to know the time in which we're living and know our communities, one way we can do that is just by talking and telling our stories. So that's where I would encourage people to go.
I find complete truth in what you're saying, because every story I've heard from my parents' past and my grandparents' past, I have just found fascinating.
Fascinating. It's fascinating.
We often come to know an older generation later in life when we have a little bit of lived experience ourselves, and we know how valuable the past becomes. And we see our grandparents, they are already somewhat elderly by the time we even know them. And we don't know what their past looked like. And I was fascinated to find out that my grandmother played basketball. And she was a foreman in a lumber company during World War II and ran like a bandsaw and just did all these fascinating things I would never have suspected. She rode my grandfather's motorcycle, which I think was like an Indian motorcycle, and just fascinating things that you don't think about older people doing. Well,
No.
they did those things when they were young.
We never think that the people who are older than us had lives other than the part of their lives committed to us.
Exactly.
We just forget entirely. We just ignore entirely the concept that they're individuals with an entire spread of their own stories to tell. And this is what we forget as storytellers. We think that so often we get wrapped up in our lives and we define ourselves. And this is in many ways a good thing. But, as a parent, you define yourself as a parent. As a worker, you define yourself as a worker. And you kind of compartmentalize our lives in these ways. And we forget all of the other interesting stuff before our lives had compartments, before we knew to compartmentalize our lives. And that's not to say we don't have extraordinary experiences now, but we don't allow ourselves to remember the extraordinary. We just get locked on the ordinary sometimes. And I think that's part of the reason people think they don't have stories to tell. It's just that their brains are locked on the ordinary and they're forgetting the parts of their lives that were extraordinary.
That's right. Well, let's change gears a little bit, because a lot of the folks who are listening today are going to be family caregivers to aging adults. And that's what our organization is all about. And, they seem like a really natural fit for this kind of preservation of generational memories. So tell me what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we mentioned this just earlier as well. It's the idea of having a guide for many older folks especially, and I can think of my own in-laws and my own family members, the using this thing is not as intuitive. I know that, to your point, and you're absolutely right, Karen, that it's gotten a lot easier, and a lot of people know what they're doing. And it might surprise you, who know what the kind of people who know what they're doing these days. It don't fit into boxes, but it is also true that a lot of people just don't care to learn it. That same grandmother that I spent days with logging her life refused until her very last day at 96 to have an answering machine, a simple voice answer, a phone, the kind that you push the button, the easy, simple push the button and I mean, she just wanted nothing to do with this thing, and I just and I don't fault her at all for that, not in the slightest. But of course, it did create some challenges. And had I asked her, "Hey, Grandma, just get your cell phone out," had she been living at the time there were cell phones, she wouldn't have had one, I'm sure. But had I said to her, "Get your cell phone out and just record yourself, give me your life story," there's no way that would have happened. It would never ever have happened. And so it is. Your point is a very strong one. Sometimes people have great stories worth telling. And my grandma was a wonderful storyteller. She's wonderful on camera, but she never would have done it. And so she just needed that guide. She needed somebody, in this case me, but somebody who could have been any. She needed somebody to get her there. Kind of, a Sherpa, a narrative telling Sherpa. And so caregivers of all ilk, right? Whether these are children caregivers, whether they are adult children caregivers, whether they are professional caregivers, whether they're in-house or in hospital, whomever these caregivers are, the people who are around folks and hearing those stories, they are well positioned, not just to hold the camera, to hold a pen, hold the voice recorder, put a little microphone on somebody. Also a nice little option. You get a cheap little microphone, easy and fairly cost effective. If you really want to go try this thing, you can clip it right underneath somebody. Then you don't have to hold something right up to their mouth. But the caregivers are well positioned, not just to hold the device that will capture the narrative, but to ask the questions and lead the conversation, because caregivers are the ones who are spending the most time with these folks writ large anyway. They are people who are going to be almost axiomatically familiar with the story of the person who we're talking to, who will be delivering their stories and their narratives. They are well positioned and to be the recipients of this story, because the person who's telling it will be comfortable with them. Oftentimes, just that comfort level of sitting and getting past that initial, who is this person? I don't know, and I need to be reserved with my thoughts. Getting past that could be very helpful if you're a caregiver, right? Just surmounting that initial hurdle. Did I say?
And yes, these are great points. Almost everyone carries around a cell phone today, a smartphone, but so often we're focused on looking outward at videos and all the content that's out there in the world that we forget to live in the moment and look inward at our own history. And I'm so grateful that I've had some moments of clarity where I kind of just snapped off a selfie with my mom or my dad, and now those are the greatest treasures to me. My dad's not with us any longer, and so now I have these great pictures of him, and they're pictures of him as an older person. We take a ton of pictures of kids, but we often forget about taking pictures when everybody gets older. And so there's something about being able to see yourself in the frame with a selfie and strike a flattering pose that takes away a little bit of that intimidation for people who are camera shy. And I just think it's hugely valuable. And John,
I'm sorry to interrupt. That's a great point, though. I just wanted to say to get through that point as well. And my neighbor was just telling me his mother passed away recently, and he was cleaning up her home and cleaning out her home, and stumbled across answering machine messages. And this is just his mother. Hi, I don't know what she said. Hi, it's Sylvia. I'm home. If you need me to leave me a message, this, that, or the other, whatever it was. He stumbled across a couple of these answering machine messages she had left for others. But those are now his only connection to her voice. But even hearing her just in that very simple, small way will be enough to help him remember what she sounded like when she said, "I love you." And I mean that.
That's right.
Hearing her voice in that simple little tiny way will be enough to get his mind where it needs to be for the rest of his days.
Great point. We could talk about this all day long, and I would love to, but I see we're getting short on time. Let me say this has been extremely informative, and thank you for your efforts to help people tell their stories and preserve their memories so they can live on for generations to come.
Thank you for everything you do.
Yes, thank you. Thank you also to you, our listeners. We hope this information will be helpful to you. As those who are providing care for aging adults, you no doubt know how precious your caregiving journey is to you and those you love, and what a unique opportunity it may present as you try to preserve so many memories for the future generations. We also want to thank Pace at Home in Hickory, North Carolina. They're the sponsor for all our Caregiver Community podcasts, and we're indeed grateful for their support. This program is part of the Mesh network of online shows and podcasts. You may find more of our Caregiver Community podcast on any of the platforms where you listen to podcasts. You'll also find our podcast on our website at www.acapcommunity.org. While you're on our site, we hope you'll take a few minutes to learn more about ACAP, our free educational programs for caregivers, and our local chapters. And if there are other topics you'd like us to address as a podcast, please let us know. John, thanks so much again for being with us and for all you do to support caregivers. If any of you, our listeners, have questions or would like additional information, feel free to let us know at www.acapcommunity.org or contact John at www.everlivingmemories.com or by email at John, and that's Jon, at everlivingmemories.com. Be well, everyone, and so long for now.
You've been listening to The Mesh, an online media network of shows and programs ranging from business to arts, sports to entertainment, music to community. All programs are available on the website as well as through iTunes and YouTube. Check us out online at themesh.tv. Discover other network shows and give us feedback on what you just heard.